Hello and welcome to the Base Podcast. I'm Oliver Bennett,
And I am Morgan Watkins.
and today we are going to be talking about the life and work of Russian short story writer and playwright Anton Chekhov. And we are beyond thrilled and honoured to have Professor Donald Rayfield with us today to discuss Chekhov. Donald Rayfield is Emeritus Professor of Russian and Georgian at Queen Mary University of London. He is the author, most recently, of A Seditious and Sinister Tribe, the Crimean Tartars and their Khanate, as well as Stalin and His Hangmen, Edge of Empires, A History of Georgia, which was translated into Russian and Georgian. He has translated a number of Russian and Georgian poets, playwrights, and prose writers, such as Gogol, Shalamov, and the Slovak writer Peter Pistanek. His translation of Gogol's Dead Souls, published in 2008, was praised as superb by William Boyd. But he's perhaps best known as a world authority on Russian writer Anton Chekhov. His biography, Anton Chekhov, A Life, first published in 1997, has been praised as the definitive biography by Michael Frayn and has also received praise from no less a figure than Arthur Miller. Donald, thank you very much for joining us today.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
A pleasure. So let's just get straight into it with talking about Chekhov's life. Maybe you could set the scene for us. He's born in 1860 and he's born into like a provincial backwater called Taganrog. But just set the scene for his sort of early life.
Yes, Taganrog was not altogether a provincial backwater. It was a place where one of the Tsars actually died. Put it on the map. It was an important fort that Peter the Great established or tried to, and it was a very mixed place. It had a Greek merchants in great numbers, some of them ex-pirates. It had a theatre it had an opera house with Italian singers. It had a really very good school, which Chekhov went to, a school that produced a number of doctors, writers, journalists, even revolutionaries. And so, although it was small, and until the railway reached it when Chekhov was a teenager, it was perhaps not that important. But no, it stands on the map of Russia.
And Chekhov himself, you say in the biography, was actually from, maybe two generations earlier. He was from peasant class, right?
Yes, his grandfather, he could actually boast, was a serf, a man who was not much better off than a slave, but who managed to raise enough money by working hard to buy his freedom, emancipate himself. So they felt that in their blood there was something very strong there to get out of that. And so he was upwardly mobile, in fact, a new class of Russian. And one of the ways of becoming upwardly mobile in Russia was to get a good education if you could, get into secondary school, get some sort of scholarship, and become a professional, a doctor. Once you were a doctor, you were a gentleman. You were free to travel. You were free from military service. You were free from corporal punishment. You were European, in fact. He had two elder brothers who were both in their way geniuses, but flawed. His oldest brother was probably a wonderful letter writer and possibly a very good writer, actually, but an alcoholic. And there was something wrong with him psychologically. He quarreled with people, he boasted. He never made it. He remained a fairly humble journalist all his life. The second brother was an extremely talented artist who ought to be very well known, but he was a morphine addict, and he, like Anton, had TB. And he had an even greater weakness than Anton for women, and above all for very unsuitable women. And he died without actually achieving anything. And the other siblings, well, he had a sister who was devoted to him all her life, and for the 50 years that she survived him. He had another brother who was a modest school teacher, and he had a youngest brother whom everyone rather despised. He was a rather sort of sycophantic, sweet-natured boy. So it was a big family, and the mother was sort of a woman who was unable to cope with anything, and a father who was a mixture of tyrannical and pious. It seems to me sometimes if you want to be a great writer, you need a father who goes bankrupt, like Dickens or Ibsen and Chekhov too. And then somehow the son, if he's not broken by it, takes over the household as the main source of income, as the person who takes the decisions, arranges living accommodation and everything else, and directs other people's lives. And that was part of Anton Chekhov's life, running his family.
Yeah, I really felt that in the book early on. I could feel this sort of world revolving around Anton and all these sort of people depending on him and this sort of figure in the middle of it all, with everyone kind of looking to him for stability.
Yes, they may have listened to him and they may have resented it at times, but the feature of the rest of the family was its inability to decide on anything sensible.
Was his father was called Pavel?
Yes, Pavlovich Chekhov.
Right, okay.
His father was very talented, by all accounts, a rather good musician. And although he was a bit of a pious fanatic, he had some surprising aspects to him. He made his own violin at one point. He ran several choirs in Taganrog, although the choristers always quarreled, rather cruel and brutal. But no, an interesting figure.
And do you think would he have been a tutor to a young Anton in terms of teaching him?
No, he was no good at teaching anyone, but he did want an education. Right. And the first instinct was to send him to the local Greek school on the idea that if you learnt new Greek on the Black Sea, you could be a trader and a businessman. And then they moved, he got him into the grammar school. They managed to find the fees and get some subsidies. And that was a very sensible move. And that school had some remarkable teachers in it. The Chekhov brothers were taught mathematics by the mathematics teacher who was the father of Lenin's first chief of secret police, Dzerzhinsky.
Yeah.
That must have been a very traumatic thing. Dzerzhinsky was actually sacked for being cruel to the boys. And another of his teachers was actually a rather good writer who published several stories, some of which are very similar to Chekhov's. Mm-hmm. So it was an extraordinary mix. Mm. In fact, Russian secondary education, for those who could get it, was as good in some ways as an English public school, but without the flogging, without the religion, and without the sport.
Still quite cruel places, were they?
No, the teachers were verbally cruel, I would say, the way that teachers can be in any country. But they were limited in what they could actually do to a boy.
And you know, they had to learn Greek because of the Black Sea.
Well, that was the idea, and he never succeeded. His eldest brother became very fluent in Greek.
And this is ancient Greek, or this is?
No, it was commercial Greek. It was
commercial Greek.
I think they also had they learned, those successful. They also had to learn biblical Greek and classical Greek. Greek was a hell of a subject because there were 3 versions you had to learn. But Chekhov was no good at languages. He said, "I'm good at languages, all languages except foreign ones."
And he was no good at maths as well, I see from his school.
The only example of Chekhov's maths we have is when he went to Monte Carlo and the casino, and he and her friend tried to work out a way of winning at roulette. And they took down numbers and worked out probability, and of course, like everybody else, lost a lot of money. So no, but maths wasn't really essential. He was pretty good, I think, at biology. Otherwise, he wouldn't have gotten to medical school. Mm. And in medicine, he was very good at gynecology, everyone said, particularly the women. And he was very good at a rather dreadful science of looking at someone and diagnosing them and predicting how long they would last. When he rented a cottage and the landlord said, "Well, I'm afraid it's rented for next summer," Chekhov took a look at the tenant and said, "No, you won't last that long."
And how did he develop this skill for doing this?
I think that's intuitive. It's an observation of faces, right, where you can tell from his stories how he could sort of diagnose characters. And in fact, some of Chekhov's stories have been used by professors of medicine, read them to the students and say, "What is this character going to die of?" Because the symptoms are already planted there.
Right.
And would he see his own light? Because he will die quite an early death.
And he knew it from an early age.
Did he? Right. Okay.
He knew it from an early age because so many of his relatives have died of TB, and some families, as you know, are, despite the living conditions, are prone to catching TB. And as a Moscow student and as a doctor in Russia, it was notorious that you were risking catching TB, which was, of course, then usually incurable.
Yeah. And how old was he when Pavel, his father, went bankrupt?
His father went bankrupt and had to flee town when he was a teenager in 1516. And then he fled to Moscow to escape his creditors.
And then
this young boy was left on his own to try and sort out his younger siblings and his mother, keep them above water.
And how do you think that affected him? You said that it potentially the makings for a good writer, but in what way specifically with Chekhov?
Well, it forces you to deal with people, not only your own family, but people like creditors, bankers, bailiffs. It matures you very early, I imagine. It hasn't happened to me, but but I think it's an early life experience, or a precocious life experience is something. And he liked teasing people too. And he knew how to get on their nerves, as some of his teachers reminisced when they were asked about him.
So he's sensible, but a little bit cheeky, and with some early experience, kind of beyond his years.
And very observant, and likes mixing with people. He went to a number of households of different families in town, some of them socially way above him. So he was observant from an early age.
You really get that sense in your biography of an observer.
Yes.
Very, very keen observer.
Not giving away much himself, but
Absolutely.
getting other people to give things away to him. I think in some ways a typical writer.
Absolutely. And there's times when he appears, and we'll get onto this, but there's times in his life when he appears rather cold and rather chilly.
People felt that he was cold. Yes, I think if you look at others' reaction to him, we have, apart from Chekhov's own letters, about 4,000 of them survive. There are at least 10,000 written to him, and many of them are complaints that you're not responding. You're being evasive, was elusive were the adjectives that people used of him.
Yeah.
Except for very few that got close to him, and they tended to be father figures, like his publisher, equivalent of like having Lord Beaverbrook or Rupert Murdoch as your closest friend. Rather odd for a writer.
This is are you talking about Anton? Is it Suverin?
Sorry, Suvorin, yes. A remarkable figure, a little like, say, Lord Beaverbrook or Rupert Murdoch, absolutely ruthless, very unhappily married, which is something that Chekhov loved observing, friends' unhappy marriages. He was an expert on unhappy marriages, which is why he delayed his own as long as he possibly could.
Yeah.
Do we know what's the earliest point at which he seems to be writing or reading kind of serious literature?
Well, we know what he read because we've got his library chits still survive, and his early books still survive, and he read whatever he could get hold of. The usual things in those days: Tom Sawyer, Uncle Tom's Cabin, and Dumas' Count of Monte Cristo, and so on. But he began writing not out of imitation, but because it was the easiest way to earn some extra money. When the censorship in Russia in the 1880s got more relaxed and the working classes were now, most of them had a primary school education, there were a lot of weekly magazines which wanted short stories and sketches. And you were paid in Russia, in fact, you still are paid in Russia by the line, so many kopecks per line. If you're a beginner writer, you're lucky to get 5 kopecks a line. If you're Leo Tolstoy, you've got 1 ruble 10. Explains why some Russian novels are so very, very long.
I have heard that as a theory, yeah.
But Chekhov's restricted in some ways because these are weekly journals that only had 8 pages, and they didn't want anything long. And they had to go to the censor before they could be printed. And if the censor didn't like it, your work was wasted. So it was a discipline in being short. And if you're going to be offensive, being subtly offensive, so the censor didn't realize.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So that was a training, all these early stories. I mean, if Chekhov had died as a medical student, I don't think we'd be reading him now. They're good for that sort of thing goes. But you can see with hindsight that it's a training for a major writer.
Yeah.
So the talent doesn't emerge fully formed straight away?
No, I would say no. I would say it's, in fact, once he's got his medical degree, that you can see signs of it already with odd descriptions and metaphors and a viewpoint which is not standard. But only when he's attracted attention of these newspaper owners and he's allowed to write longer stories for much more money, and then he attracts the attention of literary figures when he's in about 1885, 1886, and then he realizes he can write seriously. And
So by then he's in
Russia,
his mid.
you had several bites of the cherry in Russia. You first of all, you got printed in what they called the magazines, which were monthly magazines, sometimes 400 or 500 pages, in which half or a whole novel could be printed, apart from historical sketches. They paid very well, and that's what kept the country gentry occupied during the winter, reading these in fact, very, very good magazines, sort that don't exist anymore since we had television. And they were the main source of income. And then when you were successful there, then a publisher would take an interest, and you come out as a hardbound book.
So he trains as a doctor, and then is he working as a doctor?
Yeah, he certainly worked as a doctor for a few years, and he found it very, very distressing and very dangerous and not well paid. And in fact, there are some interesting articles about being a doctor in Russia, that your life expectancy was far below that of your patients. You were liable to catch diphtheria, typhus, TB, and die young and leave a family without any pension. You could, if you were really successful, work as a private doctor, rather like today, and then you could go around and charge big fees and treat the worried well who are rich, and ride around in a carriage with horses. But half the doctors in Russia were state employees who worked in hospitals or worked in private practice. And in Russia, there was a law: if a patient called you out, you were not allowed not to come. It was a criminal offense not to come. So you were really quite a slave, as your name was up in every chemist shop, and people could send for you, and they might give you a chicken or an embroidered pillowcase instead of a fee, but in general, it was not a good life. And so, with his family around him, living in crowded apartments, damp sometimes, he found that medicine was not a good thing to live on, and writing became more and more important. Only later, when he bought himself an estate south of Moscow and he's surrounded by peasants, that he found he was expected to treat the peasants, and the local council paid him a little bit when there were epidemics to go around vaccinating people and fighting the cholera and so on. So he remained medically active, but he tended to be a little bit brutal with his friends when they asked for help, to tell them that old age is incurable. His sister complained of terrible headaches. He told her just to take an aspirin and reconcile herself to the fact that as you get older, you get iller. There's nothing that's really stopped that. He knew himself that he was getting worse and worse, even though he didn't like to talk about it. And it was almost impossible to get him to see another doctor.
Do you think he was originally doing the medicine work out of financial necessity and because he thought he was quite good at it, or did he have a social conscience then?
He did have a social conscience. It developed, I would say, when he was a medical student and he saw what he had to do. I mean, when you were a medical student, you were treating prostitutes. Moscow was then like Paris. It was enormous population of prostitutes who had to be medically inspected every week to keep their license, and that was a way of earning money. And then you saw how they lived and how they died, of course. And then you had corpses to dissect, and in those days you didn't do it on a computer or a plastic model. There are plenty of corpses. And then you realize how the ordinary population, working classes in the factories lived and died. That awoke, I think, consciences in most Russian doctors. That's what persuaded them to go and work in difficult places for very little money. So I would say the social conscience came a little later, after his school days.
Sobering existence, isn't it, to be working with bodies and the human body? I think
It is. Although Russian university students, even if they were going to do arts and languages, just to show that their strength, would go to first-year medicine classes for dissection to see if they could watch without fainting. Right. That was a test of a new student. Other thing too that one could be said in favor of Russians then, but if not now, is that they were very sorry for the unfortunate, that when convicts were being sent to Siberia, and before the railway they had to walk there, crowds would gather and give them food and sweets and money, even if they were murderers. And even the head of the Moscow prison used to appear with each convoy and distribute things to the prisoners who were off to Siberia for life. So there was that sort of, and Chekhov's parents used to do that in Taganrog when prisoners were taken out and sometimes flogged and then sent off on this long trek. The town would turn, and people used to visit prisons the way that people visit zoos on Easter and other times with food and so on.
Yeah, and he will make that journey at some point.
He would make that journey himself.
Yeah, yeah. So he's a doctor. He doesn't enjoy it, but he's sort of doing it out of necessity. And he begins to write these stories, and he's submitting them to these publications. And would there be people all over Russia sending their short stories to these publications, trying to get?
It was for students. It was the obvious thing to try. So dozens of people tried. Not many people, except the editors had a big choice. And some of the material is surprisingly good. So it's quite competitive.
And are these the same journals that would have been?
Yes, and the Saturday issue of newspapers, and sometimes the Wednesday and Saturday would have a supplement with all sorts of things in, for which
and they previously would
contributors be paid.
They previously would have published Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, Pushkin.
And then if it turned out that they were selling more copies because of your work, they'd raise your fees and so on.
Right, and then in the 1880s, and in his sort of mid-20s, he's noticed by this Suvorin figure, who's this
Suvorin, who keeps an eye on the editors of the popular fiction. Suvorin is running the equivalent of the Times. In fact, his newspaper was called the New Times. It was almost the newspaper of record in Russia, very conservative, very nationalistic, but very well sourced because he had journalists placed in Germany, in Britain, in France, and he had the ear of ministers. He was quite a rich man. He ran all the bookstalls on the Russian railways. They all belonged to him. So sort of W.H. Smith as well as Murdoch. So once you were being published by him, your books were sold all over the place. Suvorin also took two other men who'd come from Taganrog to run his business. So he too came from very humble origins. His father was a simple soldier from the provinces, and he boasted his first wife had done her own washing, which was the lowest form of socially for a woman to be in a state where you didn't have someone to do your washing for you. So he had sympathy with Chekhov as a man who'd come up right from the bottom.
I found reading your book that this character, I'd never heard of this character before. I'd heard of Stanislavski, obviously, and Danchenko and Olga Nipper and some of the siblings and his nephew. Suvorin he feels like a huge character in the Anton Chekhov story.
He was a huge character inside, but he was in some ways very secretive, that when people died, he insisted they return all the letters they'd had from him, and they've all disappeared. So
how do you enforce that? How do you make that happen?
Well, he offered to pay for the funeral if you could have all the letters.
and you only give them the money once they send your letters back. Was that
yes.
what you...
Then, yeah.
That feels like quite a Murdochian thing to do.
Yes, that is. Yes.
So this is brilliant. So he's beginning to establish himself with these short stories. And I, as an actor, I've only really known Chekhov through the plays. And what's also quite fascinating in his life is that the plays seem to happen in quite a short period at the end of his life. I know there's Ivanov, which is earlier on.
Well, he did try early on. He did. People keep on trying to stage Platonov.
Yes.
The Almeida fairly recently, and Michael Frayn rewrote it as Wild Honey. And Chekhov wrote that as a schoolboy. If you performed it as written, it would take 4.5 hours. It's unperformable. On the other hand, it's got a lot of features of the cherry orchard in it. It's got the mysterious breaking string noise in a mine deep below the surface. It's got characters who say, I could have been Schopenhauer, I could have been Christopher Columbus, as in the later plays. So the idea of a play was there right from the start. It's just that he didn't know how to write one. And he wrote Ivanov, his first reasonably successful play that is actually stageable and actable, after going to the theatre and telling the theatre director that your plays are dreadful. The stuff you put on is execrable, and writing really dreadful reviews of them. And this theatre director, Fyodor Korsh, who we'll come across later, said, well, if you think they're so dreadful, then why don't you write one yourself? And he did. And he seems to have taken advice from Suvorin, because Suvorin helped him produce it. And he helped Suvorin produce Suvorin's play, a terribly anti-Semitic piece. which is why Ivanov, who we know it, is actually pro-Semitic. It has a Jewish heroine. And he learnt to keep the play short. But he wasn't sure whether it was a tragedy or a comedy. In fact, various versions have those different subtitles. And the audiences were also puzzled, and the actors couldn't understand it. He had to draw diagrams of the progression of a depressive illness, or what happens to you when you have a depressive illness. So it's Ivanov is a sort of experiment with tutors. And I think its partial success taught him how, but real success as a playwright only came when he had a theatre that was ready to put on that sort of play. Like plays where at the end of each act there'd be a sort of cliffhanger and the audience would stand up and shout bravo, bravo. And they liked it to be something, a vehicle for a famous actor or actress. The idea of a play in which the actor and actress are somehow ludicrous or pathetic or failures, that is something audiences weren't ready for. And the idea that a comedy could be a tragedy at the same time. It was really imported from Germany, from the plays of Gerhard Hauptmann, from the Meiningen Theatre. The theatre of Meyerhold and Stanislavski came, and they were looking for playwrights. And Chekhov was the only Russian playwright writing that sort of play.
Yeah.
So it was a lucky sort of synthesis of a new type of theatre and a new type of director. And what Chekhov liked about the new theatre was the director and the author came first. Whereas in the old theatre, it was the actor, the star. They're all sort of Hollywood style, star-led, even the very greatest Russian plays. In fact, you look at Russian drama before Chekhov, there's only one professional Russian dramatist in the whole history of Russian drama. By professional dramatist, I mean someone who makes actually a living writing plays which are produced. And that was Ostrovsky, who was a very original and very peculiar dramatist. Chekhov was the first, and it was only possible when you had a director who had a completely, rather like Chekhov, tyrannical view of actors and actresses. Rather like it was with music, where the conductor was really superfluous until the second half of the 19th century. It was the leader of the orchestra who decided how they would play. And once the famous conductor appeared, then things totally changed. You had a tyrant in charge, and if you didn't keep to his beat and his interpretation, you were out of the orchestra. And with the new arts, the Moscow Arts Theatre, which came around 1897, 1898, that was the beginning of modern Russian theatre, and Chekhov was still alive, and they were able to pick up the plays that had failed and turn them into mad successes.
Yeah. Did they have access to the plays by August Strindberg and Ibsen in Russia?
Ibsen, yes. Chekhov, for some reason, didn't like Ibsen, or he pretended not to. Strindberg, one of his girlfriends translated Strindberg. In fact, two of his girlfriends translated Strindberg, and Chekhov laughed at Strindberg. I've never looked at the translations. I'm not sure whether it was Strindberg he was laughing at or the translation. But it may be there aren't many laughs in Ibsen or Strindberg, and Chekhov, even in the most tragic work, liked to have something absurd and laughable.
Yes, that's an interesting differentiation.
But you did like Gerhard Hauptmann, Lonely People, Einsame Menschen, is certainly a play that influenced Chekhov. Again, he didn't read things in the original. He had some French. He could read French reasonably well, but not with pleasure. And German, although you had to learn German if you were going to be a medical student, because a lot of your professors didn't speak Russian but well. They were Germans. Even so, he never really learned it well enough to read.
And Donald, could I ask you about this play, Platonov?
Platonov, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Is that the translation of the word fatherless? Is that right?
Well, there's been an argument out this. He seems to have written a play called Fatherlessness.
Yes.
I think it's been lost because there's nothing about fatherlessness in Platonov. And Platonov was not a title that Chekhov gave the play. It's a title I think his sister gave it when she found it. I think he thought he'd destroyed it, but his sister tended to pick things out of the wastepaper basket and file them away.
So there is this play that he did write at one point called Fatherlessness.
Yes, he seems to have written it, but it's been lost.
It's been lost.
And his elder brother said it was rubbish.
Okay. I find one of the things that kind of appeared to me thinking about Chekhov when I was reading your book and thinking about my knowledge of the Chekhov plays is the lack of a sort of strong father figure in any of the plays. Actually, there's always a lack of that, and I find that
Yes,
quite fascinating that his first play is called this mysterious kind of missing play is called
you,
Fatherlessness.
you're right, actually. I hadn't thought about that, but no, father figures are missing, or where they exist, they're totally useless, like the professor in Uncle Vanya, who's not exactly a father figure. Um,
Yeah, they're
he's
not there.
married a girl young enough to be his daughter, but he's hardly a father figure. He's a pathetic hanger-on.
Mm.
Yeah,
Or the
there's
father in Three Sisters is dead, just
Yes,
not there at all.
there's usually a corpse behind a Chekhov play. There's a child that is drowned in Cherry Orchard. There's a husband that's died. There's something, a shadow over the play. And yes, you're right.
I saw a production of Ivanov with Kenneth Branagh
I saw
playing.
it as well. Yeah.
Did you see this, Donald?
Yeah.
In the Wyndham's Theatre in probably about 15 years ago now, I'd say.
No, I think I missed that. Yes.
I thought he was absolutely fantastic. And although he's maybe some of these characters are quite pathetic, I was desperately willing him to not be pathetic. And at the very end of the play, he walks off the stage and he shoots himself. And I remember I was in the seat in the Wyndham's Theatre and I spontaneously jumped out of my seat and said, "Oh," I screamed into the theatre. And I honestly, I've never ever, I don't know what had happened to me. I think I'd just become so engaged in the piece and I'd sort of forgotten I was somewhere, anywhere. I just had this yearning, like, don't do that to yourself. Like, why have you let this all go? The sort of potentiality of characters. You have it with Constantine in some ways. He has quite a lot of potential, Constantine, I think, actually, in the
Yes.
girl. And this loss of potentiality, this waste of potentiality is tragic, isn't it, in life?
Although it's quite convincing, a young writer who is not even read by the older writer whom he admires, that is such a shock. It's worse than being rejected by the girl he loves and having that girl stolen by that older writer. It's enough, I think, to push him over the limit, especially with a mother like that. It's a shock, yes, but it's with hindsight, it's psychologically, I think, quite convincing.
Yeah, you've read quite a lot of his short stories, Ollie. I've read a few of them, but I know the plays much better.
Mm.
And I think in our world, he's this sort of enduring figure. He's almost like this sort of foundational figure that you, as an actor, you study to understand acting, and to understand Stanislavski, you have to you'll do Chekhov. And but he's famous in Russia as a writer of short stories. He's known in Russia, throughout Russia, as this great
Yes, it
writer
depends on
before he's a
opinion.
drama before he becomes a drama known as a dramatist.
And there are serious writers like Ivan Bunin, who was a short story writer above all, who said that Chekhov's short stories are perfection. They're the ideal. His plays are absolute rubbish, just a misunderstanding. There was never any orchard so big as a cherry orchard. The thing is that Chekhov was not a gentleman, and his plays are all about the gentry. And that's certainly an oddity. That the plays are about a different social class, so the landed gentry, to
Mm.
which he did not belong. His family never owned serfs. He was only playing at being a landowner for a few years. So there is that view that the plays are unacceptable. You'll find that opinion in St. Petersburg, particularly, which looked at Chekhov as a Moscow provincial. A literary opinion in Russia is rather like Scotland, where people in Edinburgh despise people from Glasgow and vice versa. Glasgow's practical earth, reality. Edinburgh is high culture and pretentiousness. And that has helped form a Russian view that he's a Muscovite writer. Moscow is his real center. Quite a lot of his life in St. Petersburg, but there's only one short story actually set in it. It's very, very odd. Hundreds of, no, not dozens of stories are set in Moscow. Dozens of stories are set in Russian country towns which resemble Taganrog in some way. But there's only one story set abroad, and there's only one story set in St. Petersburg. So he's very much a Moscow writer, and his short stories are based really on Muscovite feelings. And the plays, to many people, are an artificial dream world, which, to my mind, doesn't make them worth any less than a strictly realistic world. And it's been calculated that if you take the description of the cherry orchard, it could have fed the entire Russian Empire with cherries. There are so many. When they describe the extent of it all.
Just to go back to the short stories, if people aren't so familiar, are there specific short stories that you would really recommend as the one? I mean, in the book you noted.
Well, on a sort of desert island disc sort of thing, if you had to take one Chekhov story with you, only one, I think you'd have to take a story called My Life,
Okay.
which is about the son of an architect who drops out and marries an aspiring actress, failed marriage, but he becomes a sort of vegetarian and he looks after his sister's sister becomes pregnant and dies of TB, and he looks after the child. And he still feels all his life seems an absolute disaster. Desertion of the family. He's an outcast in the town. He's done his thing. And it's the one Chekhov story where you feel that the hero can be satisfied or at least reconciled with his life. And it has every aspect of Chekhov there, the problem of the railway, the encroachment of a new capitalist society on traditional Russian one, the problem of a rather oppressive regime, the peasantry. And so it's all there. The perpetual argument Chekhovian characters have of whether you just have to lie quiet and take it, or whether you are meant to take action, even though it'll be disastrous. I would say that's the story I would choose if I only had one. Actually, Chekhov's life is very short. He wrote more and more slowly and more carefully, but you can fit all the important stories and plays into one not very, very thick volume.
So you just take
the problem with Chekhov as a playwright. There are only 4 great plays.
If we just to go back to the chronology a bit, we've got Chekhov in sort of late 1880s. Let's say he's getting towards the end of his 20s. He's a well-known short story writer. He's had Ivanov has made him a reasonable amount of money. Is that right?
Yes, a play in Russia they said was a pension.
Yes.
Because Russia had an extraordinarily good system of collecting income for playwrights, largely because a member of the Tsar's family had once written a play, and he ensured there was a law that no matter how obscure the theatre, if it was in the wilds of Siberia, it had to pay 2% of the gross takings of the theatre for each act of the play, up to 5 acts. So everyone asked you, why don't you write a 5-act play? Why are they all 4-act plays? But even so, in summer, all urban theatres went on tour. So the money kept on rolling in from places you'd never heard of. It was a highly efficient system.
So he's becoming financially stable, not like
he would be very well off if only his family had not required so much subsidy. And the solution eventually, at the end of the 90s, was the solution that Russian writers hoped for if they lived long enough, was some publisher would say, right, you've written all this stuff, give me the rights to the whole lot, and I will do your collected works, and it'll be a subscription. And then the money, it could be a lot. It could be, in today's money, £500,000. And Chekhov, in fact, felt cheated because he agreed to quite a small sum, but he did have a bank account and he could travel first class and build houses and gardens in several places.
Yes, he starts to build this house in the country. So he's
right. And okay, so we're at the sort of end of the 1880s. And then in the early 1890s, we're about to approach this sort of 14 years of kind of, in theatre history, it's pivotal kind of time. He's going to create these kind of famous plays that are widely known as masterpieces that are still all over London stages right now.
The end of the 1890s, the actual 1890s were in some ways a fallow period, because after Ivanov, he wrote The Wood Demon, which was a terrible failure. It was one of those plays where the main actor died on stage, literally died of TB and a heart attack. And that was a play nobody else ever wants to perform again when that happens.
Oh, so this is during the performance, an actor died?
Yes, during the performance, yeah.
Oh, good God, I didn't know that. Okay.
Yes.
And so this was, he wrote The Wood Demon, and then he goes, so when does his journey, this very odd journey to this place called...
Yes, that was, the people who didn't like Chekhov's stories said that he was indifferent to suffering. He observed it, he didn't propose any solutions to it. He was cold about it. He had no social conscience. The left wing disliked him for that. partly because he was friendly with a right-wing publisher like Suvorin. That was one reason to go. He wanted to prove that he did care. Secondly, there are a number of women in his life who demanded a positive answer to their interest. Some even wanted to accompany him. So this was an escape. He could say, I'm going to be away for 6 months and the post doesn't work from the island of Sakhalin to Europe, so you won't be hearing from me. And he could then hope that they would find someone else to look after. And that was another motive, definitely. And he admired greatly a Russian explorer of Tibet and China called Przhevalsky, the man who found Przhevalsky's horse, wild horse of Mongolia. And he actually wrote an obituary of Przhevalsky, not knowing that Przhevalsky was an extremely violent, unpleasant nationalist who wanted to exterminate the Mongolian people and put, as I imagine that President Trump might want to, populate the country with Cossacks instead. And he wanted to, so the first journey actually followed Przhevalsky's first expedition to eastern Siberia. And he chose the worst time to do it, which is spring when the snow is melted and all the rivers are flooded. And the problem with Siberia is all the rivers flow the wrong way. They flow north to the Arctic, and sometimes they're a mile wide, and there's still snow and ice, but you have to cross them. It's an extremely dangerous journey, even for a healthy person. And you do it by hiring a coachman at enormous expense. And of course, if you have TB, it's not something the doctor advises you to do. So he gets to Sakhalin, it takes him a couple of months, and then he starts an extraordinary thing of, there are 10,000 convicts there. He has the local office print 10,000 questionnaires for each convict, where you come from, what you're convicted of, what illnesses you've got. Great big one-man medical survey. And he travels all over this island, which has virtually no roads. It's populated by convicts actually serving their sentence or released, and a few natives like the Ainu. And he complains about the use of flogging, capital punishment, which went on there, the corruption of the officials, the fact that the hospitals had no medicines, just brandy for the doctors, the schools were non-existent, and so on. He had the Ministry of he got to Suvorin, who arranged for the Ministry of Education to send textbooks, and things did slightly improve after Chekhov was there. And then he got a ship home. There was a new shipping service from Sakhalin that went right round through the Suez Canal to Odessa. But it was a very depressing experience, a really depressing experience. But he could be proud of himself. I've done this. I proved myself as a man with a social conscience. I probably destroyed my health. Well, he certainly shortened his life with that. And I may have improved the life of our Botany Bay, our Devil's Island, or whatever you want to call it, the worst bit of Russia. So it was, to his mind, his best achievement. And he wrote it up, his only long work. And he was most upset to find that Moscow University would not award him a doctorate for it, which would have made him a professor of medicine. Maybe an explanation why professors come off very badly in Chekhov's later work.
And what would be a modern equivalent of taking this journey for me in London, in East London?
You in London, I suppose you could go to the South Pole on your own with a few dogs.
That's as severe as it would have been.
Yes, except you wouldn't do society any good at all. Or you cross the Congo from Kinshasa to Goma, distributing vaccines, perhaps.
And there'd be 10,000 convicts in the South Pole with me.
There'd be 10,000 people working for various gangs or foreign governments, or who might want to kidnap you. You see, it was as dangerous as that. I would say your chances of coming back alive and well were about the same.
What an extraordinary thing to do.
It was dangerous not just for his health, but there was a possibility that it could be violent, and he could be injured in some way.
Yes, I mean, it was more likely to be an accident. I mean, he was thrown off his cart into the ice ruts at one point, and yes, you weren't likely to be killed by the convicts, who seemed rather nicer than the warders in the prison. But on the returning journey, which no prisoner ever returned from Sakhalin, just warders were taking their retirement. Some of them, one died and buried at sea and so on. Yes.
How amazing! Before we move on to the Seagull, perhaps there is a play in your book that I've been searching for that he wrote, and you in your book say it's the most extraordinary play he writes, and it's a response to a play written by Savorin, Rapina Titania or something.
Yes, Tatiana Repina. It's based on a real thing of, again, this is something that you went to the Russian theatre for. The actress committed real suicide on play. She was supposed to act dying of poison. She took real poison. And what Chekhov's play is finally about her funeral, where various people gossip and talk about it. But the point is that it's people talking over each other, sometimes irrelevantly. It's almost surreal, not a naturalistic.
How can one access this play? I've been searching for it online. Is there any?
It does exist as an English edition of published in America, Tatiana Repina and Savorin's play on the same subject. Savorin's play has a woman committing suicide because a Jewish moneylender has blackmailed her. Whereas Chekhov turns it round.
Okay, so we must. I want to. I need to.
Yes, I'll find it for you. If it's not online, it may be online. But it's certainly been published, and you can find it in a library or two.
Okay.
Is it
But
staged?
I know it's been performed. The two have been performed together, and it's quite an interesting experience, apparently, by all accounts. But no major theatre has taken it up yet.
Okay.
Interesting. Well, maybe we should take on that challenge of.
Yes. It's Savorin's first success on stage too, because he didn't have much success with his plays and his prose.
Yeah. Okay. This is wonderful. I'm gonna search this out. So he returns from this incredible voyage
with
a mongoose.
With a mongoose, and what he thought was another mongoose turned out to be a palm cat. He'd been sold, but and the mongoose. This is the other odd thing about Chekhov. The only photograph of him cuddling anybody is cuddling a mongoose and cuddling a dachshund. They're the most intimate pictures we have of him, and both those animals came to a bad end. The mongoose liked to bite people's toes and dig in bags and became a bit of a nuisance, and people complained about it. It escaped in the Russian countryside but was recaptured. And then in the early 1890s, Chekhov wrote an anonymous article about Moscow Zoo as a graveyard for animals. It was a pretty appalling place then because they used to have wolf baiting with dogs as a spectator sport in the zoo, even though the zoo was run by a professor who was a zoologist. And Chekhov wrote a newspaper article denouncing it. And then a few weeks later, he wrote to the director of the zoo saying, I have a mongoose, which is very tame and eats eggs and so on. Would you like to have it? And he gave the mongoose to the zoo. His sister used to visit it and feed it and comb it and so on. But when I looked at the zoo records, that mongoose wasn't alive after another 2 years. Totally dead. And the same thing with his beloved dachshunds. When he sold the estate, 45 miles south of Moscow, went to Crimea, he just abandoned the dachshunds.
He just left them.
Yeah, one had its eye, it was torn to pieces by yard dogs, and the other seems to have caught rabies and died.
Wow.
So it's a side of Chekhov that's not the nicest.
Yeah, I don't feel particularly like I find him hard to relate to emotionally. I kind of can't get near him. I find him this word of you said earlier, evasive. I can kind of feel him.
When he found that he was under pressure, he could turn quite nasty. He would give women the wrong address or instructions that they were to be misled about his whereabouts. Yes, he could reject people very, 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 very firmly. His nephews and his brother's wife, who had been his mistress, he was also pretty firm with.
Right.
It was a feature of the Chekhov family, actually. Very recently, they published in full the correspondence of his widow and his sister, who both outlived him by some 50 years. And so they wrote a lot of letters. They originally were hostile to each other, but they eventually sort of divided up the inheritance. The widow looked after everything in Moscow and to do with the theatre, and Masha, the sister, lived in the Crimea and looked at everything to do with the house and the furniture and that sort of thing. But they corresponded regularly. And the thing about the correspondence, they do mention Chekhov's brothers and relatives, usually very disparagingly and sometimes angrily. They almost never mention him at all. Man who's the center of your lives for 50 years, or or it becomes unmentionable.
Right. I've been reading Strindberg's biography by Sue Prideaux, and even though Strindberg is kind of quite a controversial character, he's all over the place, I can feel sort of connect to him more, and I can sort of feel him actively in the world, trying things out, doing things, making mistakes, kind of coming up with new ideas, writes this amazing play when he's 23, and whereas
More heart on his sleeve, kind of.
heart on his sleeve, and Chekhov's this character in the middle of this all, and then when you see his plays, you read his plays, you feel this observance on all of this brilliant observance that I find with Chekhov, the more you scrutinize it and investigate it, the richer it almost becomes. And I remember this at drama school. I was like, well, who is this? Who is Chekhov? Who is this guy Chekhov? And as I studied him, I was like, oh, wow, every line links up and this line comes in. When you first read it, you think, why on earth is the doctor saying that at that point? And then as you study it and you put it together, it makes brilliant sense, as if he's observed.
Yes, there are all sorts of hints about one of his things that I think is unique to him is that he realizes people who are related to each other or have known each other for a long time start to use the same phrases. And so phrases move from one character to another. And you guess the relationship by the fact that they share this sort of idiolect, this language of their own. I don't know of any other writer that does this on stage, has that sort of ear, an extraordinary ear for relationship. And then, as you say about the doctor, you understand, for instance, that the doctor reveals his relationship to the characters. Sometimes he could be the father of one of them. He never actually says so.
Yeah.
But there it is.